Imagine that you received 400 cruzados from the King of Portugal in the 15th century, and with that money, you were sent on a mission to infiltrate the Arab world, disguised as a merchant, to find out where the spices come from and where the legendary kingdom of Prester John is. And what's more, you could only return home after completing both missions. It was this strange task that was given to the spy Pero de Covilhã in one of the most secret and daring undertakings in the history of Portugal, and that would have a surprising impact on the arrival of the Portuguese in the Indian Ocean. In today's video, we're going to dive into the incredible journey of Pero de Covilhã, the greatest spy of the age of discovery. To understand Pero de Covilhã's mission, we first need to understand King John II's clear obsession. At the end of the 15th century, he was eager to know exactly where the spices came from, which were used as medicines and sold at extremely high prices in Europe. Their origin was unknown. It was only known that Arab and Venetian intermediaries brought them. And the king also had a second wish, to find the legendary kingdom of Prester John. The kingdom of Prester John was a medieval legend that spoke of a powerful Christian king isolated among infidels who could be a great ally. The legend described a kingdom full of wonders. Prester John lived near the fountain of youth, and at the bottom of his rivers there were crystals. He was an extremely wealthy king and in fact lived very close to the Garden of Eden. Finding Prester John was something very close to finding paradise on earth, especially in the fight against the infidels, since he was a very wealthy king with a very powerful army. And that's how Dom Joan II had a brilliant idea. In 1487, he decided to pursue the same goals by two different paths. By sea, he sent Bartolomeu Dias to sail down the African coast and try to find the point where the continent ended. And by land, in the same year, he sent two spies through the Mediterranean precisely to take the opposite route, to reach India and Prester John by the routes of Middle Eastern merchants, and in this way, to immediately discover everything that those who would sail around Africa would not be able to find out. In this way, King John II creates a real pincer movement around India. Because if Bartolomeu Dias was the seaborne arm, the overland arm would be entrusted to a clever young man named Pero de Covilhã. Pero was born around the year 1450 in the city of Covilhã, in Portugal. While still young, he went to live in Castile, where he served in the powerful house of Medina Sidonia in Seville. And over time, he returned to Portugal and entered the service of the court, first under Afonso X and then under King John II. Pero had a set of extremely rare talents for that time. He spoke Arabic and Castilian very fluently, was familiar with the customs of the Moors, and had an extraordinary courage and composure. Precisely because of that, King John II had already used him on some missions in Castile to identify fugitives who were conspiring against the king, as well as other missions in North Africa that he successfully completed. In this way, the king gives him a mission together with Afonso de Paiva. Both of them were supposed to find out where the spices came from and also find the kingdom of Prester John. The two were instructed on how to behave as merchants and where they should go in pursuit of their goals, being provided with maritime maps. And so, on May 7th, 1487, the two Portuguese spies left Santarém heading east, crossed the south of the peninsula to Barcelona, and from there took a ship to Naples. From Naples, they departed for the island of Rhodes, and from there to Alexandria, and then to Cairo, the great commercial heart of the Islamic world. And in Cairo, they mingled with caravans of merchants and went undercover, traveling down the Red Sea to the port of Aden at the entrance to Arabia. And it was there, on the coast of Yemen, that the two spies parted ways. They arranged to meet again in Cairo to exchange everything they discovered. Afonso de Paiva would head to Ethiopia in search of Prester John. Pero de Covilhã, on the other hand, would go in search of the source of the spices, India. And by boarding the Arab ships that crossed the Indian Ocean, Covilhã did something that no Portuguese had done before. He arrived in India more than 10 years before Vasco da Gama. Not by sailing around Africa, but by the same secret route that Muslim navigators had used for centuries. And there, he uncovered piece by piece the secret that Portugal had pursued for generations. He passed through Kannur, Calicut, and Goa, and he realized not only the wealth of the cities, but also that Calicut was the great center, the hub of all the spice trade. It was there that pepper, ginger, and cinnamon were gathered before being sent to the caravans bound for the west. And Covilhã observed everything: the ports, the prices, the products, the winds, the rhythm of the monsoons. He heard about the island where nutmeg came from, and another where cinnamon came from. But he didn't stop there. And it was on the return journey that he made his most important discovery of all. Instead of returning directly to Cairo, he first sailed down the east coast of Africa. But first he passed through Hormuz, at the entrance to the Persian Gulf, and then went down the African coast, Mombasa, Kilwa, Malindi, until he reached Sofala, in present-day Mozambique. And Sofala was the key to another great treasure, because that was where Africa's gold passed through. However, the most important thing was not even the gold, but rather a geographical conclusion. By studying that coast, he realized that by rounding the southern tip of Africa, it was perfectly possible to get from the Atlantic Ocean to India. In other words, that the two oceans were connected, and that a fleet coming from Portugal could indeed reach Calicut by sea. And there lies the most impressive coincidence of all. While Covilhã was reaching this conclusion from inside the Indian Ocean, on the other side of the world, Bartolomeo was already rounding the Cape of Good Hope and arriving at exactly the same conclusion from the Atlantic side. The two arms of King John II's pincer movement were about to meet. All that remained was to join the two map halves. And it was to put these halves together that, at the beginning of 1491, Pero de Covilhã returned to Cairo, as he had agreed, to meet up with Afonso de Paiva again. However, Paiva was not there. Covilhã found out that his companion had died, a victim of the plague, without having managed to tell anyone what he had seen in Ethiopia. Still, two other people were waiting for him, two Portuguese Jews who were sent by King John II to look for him. They were Rabbi Abraham de Beja, and the other was José Zapatero from Lamego. And both of them brought strict orders from the king. If the mission had already been accomplished, Covilhã could return to Portugal. However, if he still hadn't seen Prester John with his own eyes, shouldn't he keep going until he did? It was then that Pero would have written a detailed report to King John II of everything he had learned about navigation and trade in the Indian Ocean, the ports, the routes, the spices, the connection between the oceans. And he gave this letter to José Zapatero from Lamego so that he could take it to Portugal. And this is where the story holds some of its greatest mysteries. It is not known for sure whether this account arrived intact in Portugal, or if it was smuggled into other kingdoms, or if it simply got lost along the way. But if it did arrive, would it have been one of the most precious tools in preparing Vasco da Gama's journey, which would set out almost 10 years later? What we do know is that Vasco da Gama, when crossing the Indian Ocean, did exactly what Covilhã had mapped out. He headed straight for Calicut. However, the link between one thing and the other, no matter how likely it seems, is still a subject of debate among historians. It's something that, given the secrecy of operations at the time, is still the subject of speculation. Anyway, Covilhã helps the rabbi map Hormuz and then sets off towards Prester John. According to tradition, he managed to enter Mecca and Medina in disguise, an extraordinary feat for a European Christian of that time. And around 1493, he finally reached his destination, the court of the Negus of Ethiopia, the Christian emperor whom Europeans called Prester John. There, he delivers to Emperor Iskender the letters that King John II had written, duly translated into Arabic. And the mission was now completely accomplished. Covilhã had unlocked the mystery of India and found Prester John, the two things the king had asked him to do. All that was left was to return home. But that was precisely the one thing he wouldn't be able to do. That's because, shortly after, the emperor would die, plunging Ethiopia into a succession crisis. And so Pero was forbidden to leave. At the same time he was forbidden to leave, he was also granted land, positions close to the throne, wealth, and ended up getting married and starting a family, becoming a rich and respected man. He even became an advisor to Queen Elene's court, one of the most powerful figures in Ethiopia. And it was on his advice that the queen sent an ambassador to Lisbon, asking for Portugal's help against Ethiopia's Muslim enemies in 1514. And later, it was thanks to that advice that the Portuguese would open the diplomatic path that years later would lead Portugal to help Ethiopia in the expedition of Cristóvão da Gama, son of Vasco da Gama. In other words, on the other side of the world, completely isolated, Pero de Covilhã was still shaping the future of the Portuguese Empire. And then the years went by, and the years turned into decades. While Covilhã was growing old in Ethiopia, the world was changing completely. John II had died, Vasco da Gama had reached India, Cabral had arrived in Brazil, and Portugal had established its entire empire in the east. And Covilhã, the man who had started all of that, remained forgotten in the mountains of Ethiopia, with almost no one in Portugal knowing that he was still alive. Until in 1520, a Portuguese embassy finally arrived in Ethiopia, led by Dom Rodrigo de Lima, and among its members was a priest named Francisco Alvarez. And that's when the reunion happened. The Portuguese found him alive, an old man over 70 who had spent about 30 years among the Ethiopians. And upon meeting the Portuguese again, he tells Father Francisco Alvarez his whole story of adventures. And is it thanks to this account that we know the saga of Pero de Covilhã to this day? Francisco Alvarez recorded everything in a work called The True Information About the Lands of Prester John of the Indies, which would be published in Lisbon in 1540 at the request of King John III. Without this encounter, would Portugal's greatest spy have disappeared completely from history? However, there is a poignant detail in this reunion. After 30 years among the Ethiopians, with the chance to finally return home right before his eyes, Pero de Covilhã chose not to return to Portugal. Instead, he sends his son with the letter to the king. However, the young man ends up dying along the way. But he spent the first half of his life trying to reach the kingdom of Prester John and spent the second half trapped in it. But Pero de Covilhã would die somewhere in the mountains of Ethiopia around the year 1530, and the two halves of the map drawn by Pero and Bartolomeo Dias met in the sails of Vasco da Gama. But if Vasco is celebrated in books and literary works, praised as the hero he was, Pero doesn't even have a known grave? However, such an important man for the rising empire is nowadays immortalized in the building. And you,
todo o país com dos grandes nomes da espionagem e da expansão ultramarina portuguesa. E você?
Did you know the story of Pero de Covilhã? Did you imagine that the route to India had already been mapped out by him before? What surprised you the most? So go ahead and leave your comment right now to support our work, and take the opportunity to become a member of the channel right now. That way, you'll be able to dive deeper and learn more and more about the fascinating history of Iberia.